All right, Alexander, let's talk about the phone call between Trump and Putin. The phone call, the Truth Social post from Trump, the Kremlin's statements, the interviews that, not interviews, the mini press conference that Trump gave as he was in the room with Tulsi Gabbard, who has now been confirmed as director of Intel, of DNI, of National Intelligence. And we also have Pete Hegseth and the comments that he made. Wow, Pete Hegseth. He actually made his comments before we got the call from the announcement of the call from Trump and Putin. And all of this was very well timed right before the Munich Security Conference. So let's begin. Where do you want to begin?
Yesterday was an astonishing day. And a lot of this, I think, there was a lot of theatre, by the way. And I'm not sure to what extent it was planned like that. But, if it was planned like that, then it was planned brilliantly. And I think I would say this. All of these things all happening one after the other. Again, it's what we see from the administration. You do astonishing things, and you throw everybody else off balance. You could see this with the reactions in Europe. You could see this with the reactions in Ukraine. I saw this yesterday in the media here in London. I've been checking the European media as well. They are in complete shock. And as I said, it is exactly the same pattern which we see with the administration use domestically. You hit in every direction at once, but there is purpose behind it. So let's start. I think the first place to start actually is with the Trump-Putin telephone call, because that is the single big event. The Hegseth speech is in some ways, as important. Right. Now, this was, I am convinced, the first actual telephone call between Putin and Trump. And we've had hints and reports, some from Trump himself, that there have been previous discussions and earlier conversations. The Russians, as we said, seemed to be really surprised that Trump was saying those things. And I think we can now say with some confidence that this was the first actual call. All of the other hints that Trump was making were, I think, preparations for the call that finally came. And to some extent they were, I think, there was some degree of misdirection. But there were contacts between the Russians and the Americans, except those contacts were not the contacts that we were all looking at. So we have Kellogg, General Kellogg. He is the official Ukraine peace envoy. He is going around Europe. He's coming up with his plans. We discussed his plans in many programs. We've said that they were unworkable, that the Russians would never accept them, that they would never go for a freeze. He appears to have been the person who was coming up with all of these threats to the Russians, all-out economic war if they didn't agree to a freeze, bribes, that we'll lift the sanctions here and those sanctions there if you come round. He spends his time traveling around Europe. I should make it clear, I believe, I should say that I think he was acting in total good faith. I think he really thought he was acting as the point man for the administration on all of these questions. So he meets the European leaders. He has a whole procession of meetings. He gives them all reassurances. He has discussions with them. He's backed by that earlier message that appeared on Truth Social about 2 weeks ago from Trump about, the Russians don't come round, he will impose these draconian sanctions and taxes and tariffs on them. And then there is the real peace envoy, who is actually Steve Witkoff. And he turns up in Moscow, unannounced. The Russians obviously know he's coming, but there's no public announcement about the fact that he's actually the real peace envoy, but he clearly is the peace envoy. he arranges for Mark Fogel to be released. And that is an important thing because Trump needs to show that dialogue with the Russians actually produces results. And Wyckoff, who is doing the real job of peace envoy, he proceeds to arrange a call between Putin and Trump. And this is a real call, and it is massive, and it lasts for 90 minutes. Now, the single most important things about the call are firstly, that the call was not just about Ukraine. It was about the whole range of relations between the United States and Russia. If you look at the Kremlin readout and you compare it with Trump's comments on Truth Social, it is actually unusual because we find that the Kremlin readout and Trump's comments actually correspond with each other. Usually when governments publish readouts and conversations, especially if it's the US government, you compare the American readout with say, the Russian one, and you would come away with the idea that two completely different conversations have taken place. This time they chime. So they discussed lots of things. They discussed AI. They discussed Iran's nuclear program. Now, remember, we said in a recent program that the Americans might actually want to talk to the Russians about this. Well, here it is. They have done. It's there in the Kremlin readout. Trump alludes to it. They discussed the situation, the general situation in the Middle East. They discussed potential future cooperation about many, many matters. Then they do talk about Ukraine. And this is really becomes extremely important because in the very first reports, media reports that appeared in London, the reports claimed that the Americans and that Trump and Putin were talking about moving towards a ceasefire. I didn't believe that for one microsecond. And in fact, when you read what Trump is saying on Truth Social and what the Kremlin is saying, it's clear that they're not talking just about a ceasefire. They're talking about a long-term, sustainable peace, which is, of course, what the Russians have been talking about. The Americans and the Russians, Trump and Putin, agreed that the war must end. Putin says that it must address the root causes, which is a signal that he is not withdrawing from his positions that he outlined in his speech to the foreign ministry on the back in June last year. And that's exactly what one would expect. Trump's comments show that the Americans are not fazed by that, because why would they object practically to what Putin set out in June 2024? It does not affect American core interests. So they're going to set up negotiating teams. Trump outlined who will be on the American negotiating team. It'll be Rubio, who is after all the Secretary of State. It will be Mike Waltz. It'll be John Radcliffe, the CIA director. It will be Steve Wyckoff. Kellogg's name is not there. And the Russians are now saying that they're working on setting up their negotiating team as well. My own guess is that it will be headed by the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. So we now have the Americans and the Russians talking to each other. They're talking about lots of things. Dialogue has been resumed between these two superpowers. And they're talking about Ukraine. They are creating negotiating teams. They're going to negotiate about Ukraine. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are not participating.
The EU is out. The UK, no mention of the UK either. And Trump's mention of, at least in his Truth Social post of Ukraine, was for him to say that we have also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation.
Yeah, inform him.
The adults have spoken. The two parties that can resolve this conflict have spoken on many issues. They also talked about energy, which I think is very important. And Trump says energy, and he says the dollar, the power of the dollar and energy. That's what he says there, artificial intelligence and the Middle East. The Middle East, Iran, just as we reported on about a week ago. And when it comes to the EU, they do not have, at least it looks like they do not have a seat at the table. They're very upset about this. Kaja Kallas even put out a post saying that the EU, along with the UK, France, Poland, Germany, Italy, and Spain, they call themselves the Weimar Plus. Interesting choice of a name. They call themselves the Weimar Plus. And my God, and they put out a statement saying that they demand a seat at the table. They must be at the table in order to sabotage a deal. That's why they want to be at the table. But interesting choice of words for Zelensky.
Yeah.
We're going to inform him. And Trump did call him. And he said, it was interesting when he was at the media event with Tulsi Gabbard, Trump said, I had a great call with Putin. And we had a very good call with Zelensky.
Yes.
He's out. He's sidelined. He's gone. He also said that Trump also mentioned that there's going to be elections. There have to be elections in Ukraine.
There have to be elections in Ukraine. He also said that Rubio and Vance are going to beat Zelensky in Munich. Again, notice that Kellogg is not mentioned.
Yeah, let me read you that actually. Yes, before you talk about that, I think it's important that you brought that up. We discussed what Trump said on the Truth Social about the call with Zelensky. He said, we discussed a variety of topics having to do with the war, but mostly the meeting that is being set up on Friday in Munich, where Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio will lead the delegation. In other words, I'm speaking with Putin and my team will inform Zelensky.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, it looks to me as if what's going to happen. I mean, we always said that, it would be an uncomfortable meeting between Zelensky and Vance because Vance is known to be a skeptic about the war and has always been so. Anyway, Vance and Rubio are going to meet Zelensky. As I say, no word about Kellogg being involved in those discussions. They're going to meet with Zelensky, and it looks to me as if they're going to be working on him. I don't think this is going to be a dialogue, actually. I think they're basically going to tell Zelensky, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what the president has decided. This is going to be from now on the policy of the United States, and you're just going to have to lump it. I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, it's going to be, it has, shall we say, a rather tough quality about it when it's discussed in this kind of way. So you're absolutely right. Zelensky is being sidelined, and the Europeans are being sidelined, and they are in complete shock. Now, what has clearly happened, and we're talking about the British, and I'm glad you mentioned the British, because clearly the British have been talking to Kellogg, and Kellogg was telling them all the things they wanted to hear, and they now are in shock because they realized that Kellogg was not the real point man that they thought he was.
Yeah.
And I think that, by the way, the White House issued a statement yesterday. I think the press spokesman actually said, that, he's still actually a very respected and important part of the team. But he's not on the negotiating team. Well, maybe he will turn up eventually, but clearly he is not the key person. And Trump mentions Wyckoff. He doesn't mention Kellogg. So, that really, I think, is, it's almost cruel, actually. It's very funny, but it's also almost cruel.
He might be around.
He might be around.
Kellogg might stick around.
Absolutely.
I
Why
wouldn't
not?
be shocked if he's at the negotiating
but he's
team
clear.
or in Munich. But
yes.
Yeah, you think you're right. He's been downgraded.
He's being downgraded. He's clearly not going to be the lead negotiator. The lead negotiator, in my opinion, all right, there will be Rubio there, but Rubio's Secretary of State, he's got an awful lot to do. My guess is that the lead negotiator is actually going to be Wyckoff. Radcliffe is clearly also going to play an important role. He's the CIA director. So that is an interesting choice of negotiators.
Well, Wyckoff to me is, I mean, you saw Pulp Fiction, Alexander. He reminds me of Harvey Keitel's character, the wolf, the guy that fixes everything. He's like the guy that fixes stuff.
Exactly.
That's what he reminds me of.
What he. That's exactly well. That's actually very savvy thing to say. Actually, it's exactly right. That is exactly what he is. He comes in, everything's a mess. He's completely he completely gets everything together. He moves at tremendous speed. He knows exactly what to do. He knows how to talk, which he does brilliantly, and he handles the whole situation with efficiency and smoothness, and that's exactly what he's doing, what Wyckoff is doing.
Yeah, so in a video I ddid a couple of days ago on my channel, I had the impression, listening to one of your videos where you were talking about Kellogg just floating around Europe, and then I was reading off of the Washington Post report, which had some information on his daughter. We won't get into the details of it. I'm sure everyone that's watching this channel has seen that report, and I was just under the impression, it just hit me. You know, it seems like Kellogg was a distraction in a way, just kind of told by Trump, talk about your ceasefire, talk about your carrot and stick, go to Europe, speak with the Lithuanians, speak with the Latvians, speak with the British, speak with Olaf Scholz, speak with Macron, and it seems like that's what he was sent to do, is to distract, while the real deal making was taking place in order to prevent a Boris Johnson type of sabotage.
Correct. That's exactly what it was. Yeah. It shows, by the way, again, that Trump and his team are being very underestimated. They clearly understand the kind of people that they're dealing with, and they moved very fast. They have actually moved, I mean, very, very fast, and they've got things together very, very quickly. Yeah. I mean, one of the things about Kellogg was just he was so obviously taking his time. He was obviously much more comfortable talking to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians than he was talking to the Russians. And, his plan was always being postponed, and he was doing the usual thing of getting everybody's opinions and, getting a bit of the British input into his plan and the German input into his plan. And it all turned out that there was no reality to it whatsoever. So the Europeans are in a mess. The Ukrainians are all over the place. As you rightly said, Zelensky's being informed. He's going to be informed again by Rubio and Vance, and it's going to be a very, very tough show. And the other big thing that happened yesterday on Ukrainian matters was that Pete Hegseth gave a speech. And that was already a shock. I mean, I was, again, watching the media in Britain as information about what Hegseth had said began to filter through. And this is the real policy of the administration, at least their initial points. So no NATO for Ukraine. No, complete acceptance that Ukraine is never going to get its lost territory back. I mean, it's incredible that this has still been a topic for discussion, but at least finally someone, and Pete Hegseth needs to be given credit for this, has acknowledged that reality. But he said other things, which is that the United States is not going to send troops to Ukraine. And the United States is not going to give guarantees to Ukraine. It is for the Europeans to do these things. We were saying right at the beginning, before the inauguration, that the best thing that the Trump people could do would be to say, look, to the Europeans, to the Ukrainians, look, if you want to just carry on as you are, by all means, go ahead and do it. But the United States is not going to be a part to that. We've done all we can. We've given vast amounts of money. Trump is saying it's now $350 billion that the United States has given to Ukraine, even more than we knew. And as we know, vast sums cannot be accounted for. Zelensky has himself admitted to this. So the Americans are now saying to the Europeans, look, if you don't like it, it's up to you. You go ahead and take our place. If you want to go on arming Ukraine and funding Ukraine and continuing with Project Ukraine, that's your business. But the United States has more serious things to talk about and deal with. We've got to focus on the Asia Pacific region where we're facing the challenge from China. And we also need to talk to the Russians about lots and lots of other things. The dollar, energy, Iran, the Middle East, you name it, we've got to talk to the Russians about it.
Yeah, and Scott Bessent is on his way to Kiev, or maybe even
I think
Kiev
he's there
right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's probably there now. And why do you send your financial guy to a meeting like this? I mean, if you're a business and your financial guy is going to meet with the CEO or the manager that you've appointed, in order to do what? In order to figure out where did all of our money go?
Exactly.
And we want our money back.
We want
That's
our money.
That's the purpose of the meeting.
That's exactly.
We want our money back. We invested in you, or the previous administration invested in you. Now we want to know where all the money went, and we want our money back.
Yes.
That's the purpose of the of the trip. No doubt about it.
And you know, if the Trump people follow through with that, which I think they will, by the way, I think they intend to follow through with that. This is going to be enormous because, as we've been saying on these programs for such a long time, as you've been saying, this has been the biggest grift of all. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars have ended up in all sorts of places. Much of that money in the United States as well. So, you know, they'll be following up on that. They'll be asking the money. They'll be following the money trails. They will lead to all sorts of interesting places. I noticed that just today, by the way, this is not perhaps directly connected to the Ukraine thing, but it is in some respects. Musk has just been saying that another media outlet that has been taking money from the US government was Reuters.
Yeah. Yeah. And Zelensky himself said that most of the money was going to the United States. Absolutely. I mean, he said that in an interview with, I believe, with Reuters, or either with Reuters or the Associated Press. He said, I've only received, what did he say, 100 billion or 70 billion?
Yeah, exactly.
The other 125 billion is in the US. So even Zelensky has said that the money is in the United States.
Yes. I mean, there's going to be, by the way, there is going to be a lot of alarm and panic on the part of many people. Just saying, at this moment in time, all sorts of files have been deleted with extreme prejudice. Let's put it like that. I mean, a lot of that is going on at the moment.
Yeah.
Very difficult, by the way, to hide money trails. If you get really efficient researchers to follow them, that I can say from direct knowledge.
Yeah, well, I mean, this thing runs very, very deep, very long, from 2014, maybe even before 2014, 2003.
Absolutely.
And it runs very, very deep. As we saw with the fact that, you know, you do have I would say it is a conflict of interest with Kellogg and his family.
Absolutely.
Who were involved in Project Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Kellogg was involved, but still, you see how wide and how deep this Project Ukraine grift was.
Yes.
So, what happens now? I think that's the big question mark. Trump mentioned an invitation to Russia, perhaps Victory Day.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
Oh.
That would be very interesting. He said that Putin was invited to the United States.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting trip. But he said the first meeting would take place most likely, he said, in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And what happens? What happens with the negotiations on Ukraine? I mean, they have a lot to discuss.
Yes.
They have a lot to talk about. And Russia is interested in a wider discussion.
Absolutely.
And they're interested in a security architecture. But Trump brought up money. He wants to get his investment back. I think that, you know, Russia could probably give some input into that.
Yeah.
Maybe they have some thoughts or ideas as to how to go about that. I don't know. you've got the war that's still going on.
Yeah.
You have the territories, the regions. You have the fact that Russia told Kellogg and his plan that they're not interested in ceasefire. They're not looking at anything like that. They're not afraid of sanctions. There's any more sanctions. All the sanctions have been put on Russia. There's no leverage that the United States has over Russia. How do you see this thing unfolding? You have the issue of the Banderites in the West. You have the denazification. You have the demilitarization.
Right. Can I just, before getting onto that, just to point out that on these programs, we actually suggested that the first Trump-Putin meeting could happen in Saudi Arabia or one of the Gulf states.
Yeah,
I think
UAE,
we actually said
Saudi Arabia.
UAE, Saudi Arabia. And
or if it was going to take place in Europe, we said either Budapest or Belgrade or Slovakia. That was what we said for Europe.
We said that there would be problems with that because it would mean passing over EU territory and all of that.
EU territory in the ICC.
And it looks, and that is exactly, anyway, we suggested that it would be the Middle East. And that is what's happening. And again, that is going to be very, very shocking to the Europeans. It's something that one should not underestimate because for the first time since relations between the Soviet Union and the United States have been established, since Russian and American leaders had been meeting, they're going to meet outside Europe. All meetings up to now have taken place in Europe. The only partial exception was the Gerald Ford and Brezhnev back in, I think it was 1973, met in Vladivostok. But in all other respects, they have always met in Europe. And again, a key country, the Europeans are finding that the affairs of Europe are being decided outside Europe. And that's going to be a major shock for them. So anyway, let's talk about everything else. There are a huge number of topics that the Americans and the Russians can talk about. The Americans are asking for their money. The Russians could help with that, actually. I mean, they can help with that. I think that if it's a question of the Americans coming back with money, the Russians are not short of money, nor are they short of resources. I mean, they could, for example, revive the deal that was going to be done with Exxon, for Exxon to have oil exploration rights in the Arctic and things of that kind. So if that's what concerns the US, if they want a transactional relationship, then that could happen. The fact that Trump is talking about going to Russia and of inviting Putin to the United States and of putting the relationships between their great countries on a good path. It's very difficult to see how the sanctions policy that we have at the moment can be sustained if that path is indeed followed. Of course, we haven't got there.
Perhaps the U.S. could have a role in Nord Stream? Perhaps the US could have a role in the transit of gas from Ukraine? Just a thought. I don't know what you think.
Absolutely. There are lots of possibilities. There are lots of things that could happen. And especially when business people get together, they can come up with all kinds of ideas. So, let's not underestimate this. But I mean, let's not explore this too much because, it's not, I think, for us to second guess how that's going to play out. But other things, the dollar, for example, the role of the dollar. Well, Putin has repeatedly said that the BRICS countries are not in the business of setting up an alternative currency to the dollar. Putin has repeatedly said that Russia didn't stop using the dollar from choice. It was driven out of the dollar by the United States. So again, I think that nothing is going to prevent the Russians now, stop the Russians now from moving forward with the BRICS financial and trade system because they cannot trust the Americans that far. But if sanctions start getting lifted, if the Americans, for example, ease off on the energy sanctions, then the Russians can start accepting payment for some of their oil, at least, in dollars again. Just saying. And that might help the Americans, that might help the Russians. I can see how that could work. For Trump, as we've said in our programs again, if he really wants to deal with domestic inflation in the United States, he needs lower energy costs. How do you get energy costs reduced quickly? You remove the restrictions on the export of Russian oil and gas. And I think that quite plausibly is where we're heading to. Instead of trying to make Russian energy exports more difficult, as Putin hinted in his discussions with, Zarubin, in response to Trump's original Truth Social message, the Russians, like the Americans, have a joint interest. They don't want the price of energy too high because that will affect their domestic industrial development. But obviously, like the Americans, they're a major energy producer. So they don't want the price of energy too low because that will impact on the profitability of their energy industries. So the Americans and the Russians can have a useful and effective discussion on this. And I think they will take that forward. I think they have a joint interest in doing so. And if they go to Saudi Arabia and they meet there, then they could also bring MBS into these discussions as well. So, this is, you could see how everything dovetails together. So they'll talk a lot about that. Now, there is, however, the issue of Ukraine. Now, what Pete Hegseth has just told us is the Project Ukraine is dead. The American the neocon project of using Ukraine as a place where you defeat Russia, you inflict a defeat on Russia, you collapse its economy through sanctions, you engineer regime change in Moscow, you do all of those things. That is over. That's finished. A line has now conclusively been drawn under that. But unfortunately, it is now littered with problems. The Russians will insist on control of the 4 regions. They will be worried. The Russians will be concerned about NATO, Ukraine's future orientation. The Americans are saying, look, we don't want Ukraine in NATO. But this is the Trump administration. In 4 years' time, we might have the Democrats come back again. They might change the policy there, just as they did before. So the Russians will want cast iron guarantees about this, as they have said. There is the issue of the Banderites in Ukraine. I cannot see how this can end without the Russians insisting on some kind of change in the structure of the government in Kiev. I mean, this, from a Russian point of view, has to be a priority now.
Tribunals?
I mean, the Russians have been talking an awful lot now about war crimes. They've just discussed more war crimes in Kursk region, in Ruskaya, in Porechnoye and in Nikolaevo Darino. Grisly war crimes if you accept the Russian claims. So, they need to have all of that done. So they will need a new government, a new structure of power in Kiev. And that will probably be the minimum of what the Russians want. Now, this will be very, very difficult for the Europeans. But if we go back to the United States and look at this purely from American interests, the perspective of US interests, why is it a problem for the United States if the Russians have a friendly government in Kiev? And perhaps some kind of a presence in Odessa and places like that. From an American point of view, given that Project Ukraine has been closed down, I don't think it is a problem. The Europeans will object. The British will go berserk over it. There are already ex-Lithuanian foreign ministers who are talking about Munich 2, referencing the 1938 Munich Agreement, which is, by the way, crazy. I mean, that's bonkers. But from a tough-minded, hard-headed American perspective, if you really want a stable situation in Europe, whereby you can move your people out of Europe, focus instead on the Asia-Pacific region, doing a deal with the Russians about security in Europe makes complete sense. The Russian demands are not extreme. They do not impact on American core interests. The Russians are not calling for the dismantling of NATO or anything of that kind. So you can probably find, if you work on it long and hard, you could probably find ways to achieve this, which will preserve the interests of the United States, protect Russian interests, and take this issue of Ukraine once and for all off the table.
Well, you start with the new elections. You get rid of the current administration.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you start there. And maybe the outlook for Ukraine will be some sort of a federation.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines with
correct
with with the regions having more autonomy. So maybe you can have a structure in that way. I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of formulas that you can come up with. Yeah.
I mean, it's worth pointing out, by the way, that right back in 2014, after the Maidan events, there was a proposal floating around for federalization in Ukraine. And it originated, by the way, with Angela Merkel. I remember this very, very well. She said to the Russians at that time, look, we understand you take a crime here. In terms of Donbass, we are prepared to go with this idea of federalization. And then John Kerry, who was then the Secretary of State, met with Lavrov in London. I remember this very, very well. And the two issued a joint statement, a Russian-American statement, which talked about Ukraine making progress towards federalization. So this is not a new idea. It's an idea that the Germans and the Americans, and when I say the Americans, I mean the Obama-Biden administration, seemed for a time as if they were prepared to run with. Of course, they didn't mean that seriously, as we now know. That was, again, all, frankly, duplicity and deceiving the Russians and trying to pull the wool over their eyes. In reality, they were already preparing to launch an offensive to take Donbass back under control. But anyway, I mean, those statements, the Lavrov-Kerry statement from, I think it was March 2014, the text is still there. If you look hard enough, you will find it.
Yeah, I mean, the solution for Ukraine, the problem for Ukraine, and in my opinion, always lied. It didn't lie in the east or even in the center. It was always in the west, and it was always this Banderite ideology that was the problem. Correct. And then when the money started to flow in from the NED, from the USAID, from the CIA, once it started to flow into the West, then that western part of Ukraine consolidated their power in the center of Ukraine, in Kiev, and that's where all of the big problems started.
Absolutely.
So you have to address that.
You have to address that. So there are ways forward. This could be done. We could have a federated Ukraine. That would mean that places like Odessa, for example, you would have a Russian presence there, quite plausibly, because it's difficult to imagine Odessa left to itself, not developing extremely close ties to Russia. You could see all of this. It will be extremely difficult to negotiate, but it is not impossible if you approach it in that kind of way. And of course, Zelensky would oppose it, but then he's probably on his way out. The Banderites will be furious about this. The Europeans will be horrified by it because, of course, federalization basically kills any prospect of Ukraine entering the EU. Well, I think it's inconceivable that will happen now.
I would say that if Russia were to allow some sort of clause in some sort of an agreement, stipulation, an agreement where Ukraine enters the EU. Given what the EU is now to NATO, it would just mean one foot in the door to NATO. So I would say that Russia would have to be bonkers to allow such a thing.
They're not bonkers. So I think that's one thing.
I would say EU has to also be off the table. That would just be my view of it.
I think we're definitely moving in that direction. And why would the Trump people care whether Ukraine enters the EU? I would say, again, I don't see that this concerns them at all. So you can actually work things through. You have to overcome Ukrainian opposition, and the Banderites are a force in Ukraine, and they haven't gone away, and they're heavily armed, and they do pose a danger. And of course, you have the problem of the Europeans, the British, the Germans. Whether the Germans continue with it remains to be seen. We'll see what happens with the elections. The elections in Germany could be heavily impacted, by the way, by the events that we've just seen. So, what the Germans are going to do, what the French are going to do, what's going to happen in Europe. Putin said that Trump isn't going to have any difficulties bringing the Europeans into line. Trump liked that and reposted that comment on Truth Social. That's probably right. But anyway, one way or the other, there will probably still be some resistance and some opposition in Europe, which is why you need to keep them out of the negotiations.
Well, you cut off the funding, so that's one way that you handle the Banderites. But I think that Russia's going to insist on some form of tribunals.
Yeah,
you have to insist on demilitarization as well.
Yes.
So you have to insist on that. But you left out one country that I think poses the greatest danger to sabotaging a future peace, and I think that's the UK.
Absolutely.
I think it's Europe, at the end of the day, the EU and much of the EU member states are complete vassals to the United States. 100%. But, you have the UK, which is a vassal to the US, but they also work behind the scenes and in the shadows, and they're very good. The MI6 and all these organizations are very good at sabotaging peace deals.
As they played a central role in sabotaging Minsk, for example, the Minsk Agreement. And yes, absolutely. And by the way, the British are in complete shock about this. They thought they'd had understandings with Kellogg, and they now understand that those were worthless, and which is completely predictable and entirely understandable. But there we go. But no, there are problems. But this is where the Americans actually do have very strong cards, because if the Europeans dig in, if they really do sabotage the negotiations or try to, if they find people in Ukraine who are prepared to work with them and sabotage the discussions too, well, the Americans always have that option. They can say to the Europeans, okay, look, we're doing what we can. You're not helpful. You're not being helpful here. If you want to take over Ukraine, if you want to arm it and fund it, it's your show. It's not us. We are trying to find a workable solution. If all you can do is obstruct, then it's your problem and no longer ours.
And no Article 5.
Don't
cry to us about Article 5 stuff.
Yeah. And I have never, I understand that Hegseth has already said that there will be no more money from the United States for Ukraine. So there it is.
Yeah. What do you make, to close the video out, what do you make of the timing of all of this with the Munich Security Conference? Interesting that it was in 2022, Munich, when much of this started.
Well,
and here we are entering Munich in a day, where it looks like this may be the beginning of the end.
Well, it is. It started in Munich and it's ending in Munich. And there is a kind of poetic justice in that, because it was at the Munich 2022 Security Conference that I first really began to think that a war was likely. Because I remember watching them all: Kamala Harris, Boris Johnson, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, Zelensky, Ursula. They were all absolutely drunk with what they were going to do. And it was clear that they wanted a war. It was clear that they wanted this massive sanctions imposed on Russia. It was clear that they thought that Russia would not be able to withstand the sanctions blow. I've never felt more depressed by what happened than when by what was happening than I did then. I remember coming away and saying to me, you could see a program I did, a video I did directly afterwards, so that I was profoundly shocked about it. And here it is. And many of the same people are going to be there again. Macron will be there. Ursula will be there. Scholz will presumably still be there. And Baerbock will be there. She was also, I remember, at the Munich Security Conference and did a crazy speech. Zelensky, of course, is still there. And they're now going to be told, you've lost. Because they have. You have lost. America has had enough. This was a complete failure. You were what you did was crazy. It was completely wrong. America has had enough. It's going to make peace. If you don't like it, you're just going to have to lump it. So there is poetic justice after all.
Do you worry about, one final question, do you worry about a false flag or something? Like they always do when they're in a panic or desperate?
Yes, of course.
Try and get Trump to recommit.
Of course.
Or to go back on everything he said.
Absolutely. And of course, there's all kinds of things going on in the Baltic. Ships being blown up, cables being damaged, stories that it's Russian ships causing the cables to be damaged, and then that is immediately contradicted. All kinds of things like that are going on. I get the sense that the Americans this time understand pretty well what is really going on. I think that this is not just, when I talk about the Americans, I don't just mean the Trump people. I mean the wider American public is now very wise to this kind of thing. I mean, they don't trust the media anymore, as we've seen, since they voted strongly for Donald Trump and for his team. So yes, it's entirely possible we're going to have some attempt to derail this. A false flag is a real possibility. I don't think it will work.
Yeah. I also think that they also lost a lot of trust from the Trump administration, all the trust from the Trump administration from Russiagate as well. I think about Russiagate a lot, especially with the UK and how the UK played a central role in Russiagate and trying to derail Trump. And even Stammer in the elections recently was very antagonistic towards Trump, and he threw it all in with Harris. So even if they try to put together some sort of sabotage or some sort of false flag, they've done so much damage to themselves with this Trump administration over the past 8 years that it's going to be difficult for Trump to trust in them.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing is, of course, the revelations with USAID about the information control, about Reuters partly owned by the US government, about the US government funding the BBC. All of that kind
Reuters
of thing.
is UK, right? Are the UK based?
Reuters is a British news agency.
Okay,
absolutely. So, I mean, all of this is going to make the Trump people even more suspicious of any stories, any shock horror revelations coming out of Ukraine or Europe now, because they've seen it all happen so many times. I don't think they trust it.
All right, let's end the video here, and we'll do another video where we discuss the military stuff and everything that's happening in Ukraine as well on the front lines. So we'll end this video here. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and X. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like what we are wearing in this video update. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.